because I used to have to clap, and now I don't have to do it, but it's a must do now, so I'm going to clap. Good stuff. Okay, so welcome to the Third Platform Technologies podcast. I've got a couple of very exciting guests for us. We're going to talk about application security. And if I can do some introductions. So I'll start with Martin, if I could. Martin and I have known each other for over 20 years, as you can see in our faces. But Martin, if you can do your own introductions to the audience, that'd be great.
Absolutely. So thanks for having me, Paul. Pleasure to be here. So my name is Martin Volk. I am a penetration tester and application security analyst. Currently, I work for Uber on a long-term contract, doing exactly that, spotting vulnerabilities, analysis of applications and the vulnerabilities associated. I used to run my own pen testing company up until 2018. And before that, I actually come from a networking background. So I spent a lot of time on the defensive side, as in firewalling, network security, and things like that, predominantly around Cisco. And then gradually, as I moved over to the offensive security side of the house, where I have 15 years of experience now.
You've turned to the dark side, right? The dark side.
I did indeed. It's more exciting.
That suits your personality, Martin, I think. Okay, thank you very much for that. Really appreciate it, and we'll get into the detail in a bit. And if I could come over then to Gonzalo, just to do a quick introduction as well.
Great. Thank you, Paul, for having me and for the invitation. I'm Gonzalo and I'm a software engineer. I've been working in IT for 8 years right now. First of all, I was a software developer, mainly on the backend side. Then I was software architecture. 3 years ago, we started our own software agency called Surf. We are now 40 engineers working mainly with non-tech businesses, trying to make them tech-enabled, or with businesses that are already in the path to be tech-enabled, that they maybe have a CTO or a small developer. Help them to grow, help them to scale, help them to maintain legacy technologies and migrate to the new ones. And yeah.
I can't keep track of your growth, Gonzalo. We're going to have to put some reins on you, some leashes, and hold you back, I think. No, appreciate the introduction. So I guess let's start it, right? So I think it was Mark Andreessen back in 2011 that said software was going to eat the world, right? And we're 10, 12, 13 years after that statement. It only seems to be going in one direction. And the latest numbers I had were something like $650 billion are spent on software and applications a year globally. And that number's expected to more than double by 2030. So clearly here to stay, clearly going to be more prevalent. If I could come to Gonzalo first, what are you seeing out there in terms of businesses adopting software generally? Are you seeing any significant changes, or is it the same basic requirements that people are coming to you with, but there's just more of them?
So in my opinion, things are changing very, very fast. I read a tweet a couple of days ago, very interesting, saying that now almost every company is a tech company. Because you can't avoid technology right now in order to scale, in order to make a business. There are a lot of software available because of the massive growth that we have in SaaS, in software as a service. So right now, companies can select if they want to have their development team, if they want to hire software as a service, many software services from different specializations. So I think that the growth that we are seeing is amazing. I'm passionate about technology, and I love what we do, because I think tech is the tool to make people more efficient, better, and faster on everything on what their mission is on the businesses and on the life. But definitely we're seeing a growth. Tech is more in the hands of people every time. So yes, and I think that this will continue now with the growth of AI and these kind of automated tools where you can now generate content, you can now automate tasks faster, better, and more efficient. I think this will continue to grow in that way.
It's interesting this because on the spin side of the quote from Mark around software eating the world, there's a lot of talk now and consensus around AI saving it, right? And so if I take what you've said, Gonzalo, there's a huge desire and demand for software. The language, I think, is changing out there. Software is no longer seen as a product, in my view. It's the solution to a number of challenges or the solution to achieving some outcomes that are related to business. Not always, but in most cases. So you've got this explosion of adoption. There's no way that the people with the software in their hands can keep up to date. And, it's hard enough for us technical people to do that, right? But you've got people in organizations that are trying to keep up to date. And now I'm going to come to Martin, because Martin is probably or has been seeing the effects of that growth, the effects of folk with a lack of experience managing the adoption and the implementation of that software in the real world. And clearly that's a challenge that the industry and customers need to at least be aware of, right? So Martin, what have you seen, I guess, in the last 5-10 years, first of all, and then talk to us about what you expect to see from here on in?
Yeah. So, what I've seen, especially on the security angle, that a lot of the technologies which we are using these days, they are fairly new, right? Like they have been developed over the last 10 years. And like, let me take GraphQL for an example, which is an API. And GraphQL wasn't around like 10 years ago, right? Like it was in development, and it's basically one of the key leading API technologies. And there is numerous others, other platforms and other software technologies or coding languages which just haven't been around. Like another API type like gRPC, for example, that is fairly new, but it's heavily adopted. Right. So the problem with that is that these technologies are so new, you won't find a security engineer who has 10 years experience in this because they were not around 10 years ago. Right. And as we speak, now we have generic or generative AI and stuff like that. It's a fairly new technology. So it's always playing catch up. Like the security folks are always playing catch up with the technology, which is being thrown out there. And then something also, you mentioned AI, which is a very interesting topic. So AI helps you to automate and facilitate and build and grow much quicker. But at the same time, AI also facilitates to launch attacks much quicker and much more efficient from the attacker side, because all the technology is available for both sides of the house, right? Like for the good guys and for the bad guys.
Yeah.
So I think this is something to really keep in mind. The more technology which is going out there, the more abuse is possible as well with these new technologies.
So one of the interesting things you've just raised then is I remember, if I go back 10 years, people talked about having penetration tests done for compliance and legislative reasons, right, for ticking boxes, and gaining a level of satisfaction as to the security posture of the infrastructure or the data or the personal identities of folk and a whole raft of other things. But what struck me at the time, and I think what's more obvious now, is whenever you take a snapshot in time, and a penetration test is simply that, it's flawed. It's inherently flawed, because literally the minute after you do that, the whole thing has changed, right? And it could have only changed a tiny little bit, or it could have changed dramatically if you're a global enterprise. So, for example, if we take APIs, and I've got some stats here because I was researching it beforehand. 75%, and Gonzalo, you may have some commentary around this. 75% of developers, all developers, are utilizing some form of APIs, and that's growing significantly as the power and the impact of access to external data and internal data grows from a data analysis perspective. And then we'll flip it and come back to Martin in terms of talking about API specifically and snapshots on infrastructure, on data integrity, but on a regular basis, because I want to revisit the AI thing and how that can help take numerous snapshots, almost enable a dynamic moving dashboard of the health of an organization, if you like. So if we can come to Gonzalo first, just for some views on APIs, the rate of adoption, the challenges that present for developers, and then obviously we can flip over to Martin and have him give us some information on what he's seeing around inherent risks with the adoption of APIs.
So in that space, is very interesting what you were saying, Paul, because and going back to my first comment, so as the state now of the software is that the software as a service is now in hands of everyone. It's very common for our organization to have, I don't know, between 5, 10, 15 softwares hired for many purposes: accountability, legal stuff, things particular of the business itself. And you may organizations need a way to centralize that, and that's usually something they build custom or they build with any of the tools available to specifically do centralization of data, where you have to connect a lot of tools into one place and see your whole data all together to get the metrics, to get the KPIs of the business, or to get whatever people want to see over there or automate over there. And that's where the APIs come in. I think that now most of the tools that we're seeing right now are API first, or the APIs, it's the thing that they build at the beginning, because they know that the rate of adoption of that software itself will be much higher if the API is good and is thought in terms of what a developer needs to do when they are integrating the tool. So knowing APIs, knowing interfaces, integrating stuff, it's very common for almost any business, and almost any developer should already know how to do that. And introducing now to what Martin probably is going to speak about, challenges in API keys, in accesses, in maybe agencies that are in the businesses that are working on tools that have sensitive information, that have credit cards, that are moving data of the business that is valuable. It's tough. It's really tough. So, and there are also solutions on this, but I think that the growing that we're seeing right now, it's also a challenge in terms of the security space and in terms of how to build good solutions that would scale in the future of the development teams that are handling these kind of things.
That's interesting. And clearly there are different types of API, Martin. And if you could distinguish the risks involved from an internal API perspective for an organization versus a third party or a partner API risk profile, that would be really useful as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, there is, first of all, I think we need to take a step back. There is like 4 really common API technologies. So SOAP XML, which was like one of the first ones, which is in XML format. So all the data is being passed from A to B in XML. That's widely discontinued now. Then you have the so-called RESTful APIs, which are using JSON as the data format. They are quite common. However, they are getting more and more replaced with GraphQL now. So with GraphQL, you only have one endpoint. So for REST API, let me give the audience like a quick overview around this. So for REST API, for example, take a shopping cart or something like this. You have, for example, a GET request is to retrieve information. A POST request is to write information. A delete request is to delete information, right? So you already have 3 endpoints effectively, right? A PUT request is like to update information. So you have 4. Just for this one microservice. Like we call this microservice. So how the architecture looks these days is if you have an application like a shopping portal or something like that, you will have so-called microservices, and the microservices mean you break the application down into small manageable pieces. So for example, if you update your password, that's one microservice, right? Like if you put stuff into the shopping cart or manage the shopping cart is another microservice. And then your favorites is another microservice. And everything is API interconnected, basically. So that's like APIs are nothing else than like data servants or data transport mechanisms between any two applications, and everything is interconnected these days because like if you take your Uber app, for example, you can not only hail a cab, but you can also use it for these days, like for example, to book a bus ride or to book a tourist trip or something like this. And in order to make the reservation, an API call is being made to that third party or to that partner. And so the problem is that you have so many API endpoints that it's very, very difficult for an organization to keep track of every single one of them, right? That's number one. So one of the biggest problems is people do their ordinary penetration testing, right? And they pen test like 10 years ago. This is still like the mindset of a lot of the companies. And then they say like, well, there's no vulnerabilities on our IIS web server, right? So we must be good. Yeah, of course there is not, because you're using cloud infrastructure these days. And a lot of this is taken care of, right? So you wouldn't find like a Windows exploit or like an Apache exploit necessarily easily. So, but these days, the vulnerabilities really are predominantly in API technology. And what I mean by that is, for example, information disclosure. So information disclosure means if I'm an attacker and I'm going through my own profile, right? So I'm going through my own profile and I analyze the API calls which are being made while I browse my own profile. I can analyze how the API works. And then as an attacker, you may be able to spot like something called UUIDs, which are ID values which distinguish the different customers. And if I change that to someone else's UUID, I may be able to retrieve their account information. So that's information disclosure, right?
Got it.
Another problem you have very common problem with APIs is access control, that there is simply not sufficient amount of access control on the API endpoint, because every API should only be accessed by someone who is, first of all, authenticated and authorized to access that endpoint, right? But if you miss one of them, that basically means you can, for example, use that API endpoint for whatever purpose. Like, let me give you an example: location data. Mm-hmm. So this is a simple one, right? Like whenever you have like a web application where basically you want to get stuff shipped to your home, right? Like it's a shopping cart or something, and then you enter your address, and as you will see, it's displaying or it's giving you options. It's giving you options like, 13 London Road or blah, 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 right? Like when you start typing like 13, yep. and it gives you like all the options. That's an API call which is being made to the Google Map API service, basically, right? And normally you should have this locked down from an access control perspective, that only the user within the application can use it. Now, if you remove the cookie, if you remove your authorization credentials, so to speak, right? And it still works, you have a bug, you have a vulnerability, because that means anyone can now access that API endpoint and use it for their own purposes. Like, for example, build it into their own application. And that's just a simple example, but it works like with everything. Like normally an API call should have some sort of authentication, like before they can even talk, right? Like this may be auth flow, or this may be like an API key or something like this. But very often, because of the speed of development, those things are not taken care of properly, right? Like so the developers are under immense pressure to put new features out and to put new services out, and the security is often lacking behind. That's one of the biggest issues with APIs, that first of all, there's so many. And I read an article recently that around about 80% of internet traffic is carried through APIs these days, which is a massive amount, right?
That's huge. And So there was something else. There was something else that I read, and I don't know whether it's connected or not. But APIs are also potentially used as tools to inject lines of code and make software kind of malicious and carry out things that shouldn't be being executed, right? So talk to us about that quickly.
Yeah. So I mean, APIs suffer. First of all, APIs have their own vulnerability classes, right? Like so, the OWASP, the Consortium for Web Application Security, they released an own API best practice security guideline around specific vulnerabilities. However, APIs also suffer from traditional web application bugs. So if you take an ordinary web application, let API out of the picture for a second. You have your classical injection bugs like SQL injection, NoSQL injection, cross-site scripting, cross-site request forgery, all the bug types which exist in traditional web applications, they also exist in exactly the same way in APIs. Now, I had incidents where I'm also engaging in bug bounty, by the way. So bug bounty is basically following or hacking companies with their permission, finding bugs, getting paid for the bugs.
Yep.
So I'm not disclosing a specific customer, but for example, I was testing an application for the classical OWASP vulnerability types, and it was secure, right? Like, so I couldn't shake anything loose. I then turned to the same company's API endpoints and repeated my vulnerability list, and I had success because the security measures they put in place, they only put on the normal web application, but they forgot they forgot those vulnerability types for the mobile application API calls.
Yeah.
And so very often you can find an access control issue or a SQL or an injection issue on the API endpoint, which the mobile app is making, which is not present on the web side of the house, and vice versa. I mean, it's also possible. But absolutely, the vulnerability types which exist in web applications are also applicable to APIs. And now, not only that, there is specific ones as well just for APIs in addition to those. So developers need to think about a lot of things, right? Like, for example, think of GraphQL. So you have the same vulnerability types as in web applications, but on top of that, you have, like, for example, the batching vulnerability, or, there's so much to take into consideration. And to make matters worse from a security angle, GraphQL, for example, comes by default in the default installation with no security attached to it. Wow. So it's all down to the developers to actually, configure certain things. But the default installations allow you to do introspection, which is querying the schema, the API schema, and which helps an attacker to understand the whole infrastructure of the customer first and foremost. And a lot of the things which you see, or a lot of the attacks, are actually based on pure misconfiguration, and misconfiguration out of the fact that customers do not know that certain things are just insecure by default, and they need to bolt on security on top of it.
But the biggest challenge, and I want to come to Gonzalo on this, because everything you're saying, if I'm a developer sitting where Gonzalo is and running teams, that is a lot. That is a lot to do. It's a lot to keep up with. And it almost feels kind of secondary to the core task at hand, right? The customer is asking you to stand up software. They're asking you to make sure it looks the part, it is the part, it's robust, it's scalable, it's secure. There's a lot of stuff going on there. But before we go over to Gonzalo and just get his take on that, because it sounds like a very stressful, pressurized world, and I'm intrigued as to how you even cope with that, to be honest, Gonzalo. But here's what I see in terms of security organizations having conversations with the market, right? Through standard collateral, standard events. It's all kind of panic, what we call ambulance chasing stuff, right? It's all like sold on fear and threat and all of the dark language that is used too much, not exclusively, and not by everyone, but it still exists out there and it's selling by fear. How do you think, and a question for both of you, but I still want to come back to Gonzalo on the pressure, so we'll save this one till after Gonzalo answers. How do we have different conversations that acknowledge the risk, they acknowledge the fact that everything is moving at pace and continues to move at pace and will probably only ever move faster from this point onwards, and engage with customers and the market in a really productive, collaborative way to reduce the overall risk for both parties? So let's come back to that as a kind of a final answer from you both. But first of all, Gonzalo, what's it like on the other side of that fence with all of that stuff going on? Are you, is that just part of the day job for you guys, or do you feel the stress and the pressure of that fast moving feast?
Well, I think it's the thing that we're used to, Paul. First of all, I must say that most of the things that Martin said of examples of vulnerabilities, I've seen them not in the past years, but in the past months in projects. When I first heard of SQL injections many years ago, I thought that was something that didn't exist anymore, because I think it's one of the risks that most of the developers and teams around the world know. And 2 months ago, we found a government API with very sensitive data that allowed SQL injections. Actually, we could basically delete all the data with just injection. Of course, we reported it.
Whoa.
So, but this is like not a fairy tale, or not something that happens to the big organizations. This happens to everyone. Sorry, not to small organizations. This happens to everyone. This is still going on, and it's a major risk. And technologies continue to grow, to improve, to have new tools, and there's, as you both said, a rush in terms of going to the market to the latest new technology, and definitely that's a risk. And many times we as an agency, we're on the other side. We're on the business side, where we have to do the things as fast as we can, where we have to develop new features all the time. And I think the important thing to do is, first of all, to have a good setup of tools, a bootstrap, which will ensure that the main topics are already covered. No matter what you're going to develop, the main things are covered. Second of all, I think the organization culture and the consciousness about security has to be always in place for the developers. We have our standards, and we always try to seek to do the most secure APIs in the time that we have with the features that were requested. And in the third point, to say that if you already have providers or different tools that are solving part of the business, for example, login and authentication, that you already have that solution developed and you know that it's secure and you test it many times, and maybe you talk with Martin and Martin said, okay, your solution is secure, and then you can replicate that solution for more of the customers, then you know you have at least one problem solved. So I think those are the 3 points that are very important when you're developing software. But of course you have to, and it's always a balance between what you are going to develop because you need it fast, and what you're going to develop because you need it secure. And if you are doing something that you know it's maybe not the best practice in terms of security, my advice would be at least put it in a backlog, know it, put it in a comment, store it anywhere for that not to be lost in time.
Don't ignore it. Don't put your head in the sand. Just if it needs to be gotten to at some stage, at least have it present. And presence of mind as well around the subject, right? That's what you're saying. So Martin, how are, thanks for that, Gonzalo, how do we start to change the conversation then out there in the market? How do we start to have kind of more mature, grown-up conversations around security in the changing landscape?
Yeah, I think it's all helping customers to make that change of mind, like that shift of mindset, that what they may still think is valid, like from 10 years ago, like a penetration test is sufficient. That's simply not good enough. I think what you need is like to engage customers in a conversation in a multi-layered approach to security, right? So what I mean by that is, first of all, when you start developing the code, even before you start writing the code, it should go through a design review. And this is how big tech companies are doing it, right? Like it should be reviewed from a security angle. Like, first of all, threat models. basically. So, okay, we are building this and we put it on a whiteboard and we are threat modeling out what could go wrong before the code is even written. Once the code is written, the code, before it goes into production, should be assessed with like a software assessment tool, like the SAST, for example, right? Like a static code analysis tool to catch the low-hanging fruit. You will never catch everything with the automated tools, but at the end of the day, there is no absolute security. You can only risk or lower the risk to acceptable levels, right? Like this is the whole goal. And then penetration testing is a good thing. That should be done on a regular basis. But what is also important, especially if you have a lot of infrastructure, a lot of software, right, is a bug bounty program. And the bug bounty program is very, very appealing for customers because you actually only pay for actual impact findings, right? Yep. So this is different to a penetration test. In a penetration test, you pay XYZ dollars to the company to do the testing, and then they come back and say like, oh, we found nothing. Yep. Great, but you spent that budget, right? Versus in bug bounty, you actually define what you're willing to pay for critical, for high, for medium vulnerability, and then only if you actually, if a security researcher presents you with one, then you actually pay for that.
Sorry to interrupt, Martin, but is that an opportunity? Because what I was going to ask, so stay on that thread, but what I was going to ask is, you know, a lot of the behavioral expectations you're talking about, to me, seem to sit at enterprise and mid-tier level. So if I think about kind of the startup world, small, medium enterprises that are lacking infrastructure, they're lacking the people skills and experience, but they're adopting technology probably faster than anyone else, is something like bug bounty a plausible route forward for them, because they're not going to have CISOs, right? Then they're not going to have that breadth and depth of expertise to go through all of these checklists. So is that a viable route forward that's affordable? Because actually, like you said, people are only paying when vulnerabilities are found, and they can determine what they're paying if it's a critical one, a mid-level one, or a small one, right? So they're in control of the budget.
Absolutely, yeah, and it totally is, because first of all, you have like, when it comes to software analysis and stuff like that, right? Like you have a ton of free software out there, open source software, which especially startups can use, right? And they're on GitHub and you download them and they work surprisingly well. They may not have the nice GUI and all these kind of things like the commercial ones, but especially for startups, when you're short on budget and stuff, they're a viable option. So is the bug bounty, actually, because you can define in the bug bounty program, hey, a critical vulnerability to my organization, I'm a startup, is only worth $500, for example.
Got it,
right?
Got it.
And you will still get people, researchers, maybe not the top tier researchers, because they go for your Apples and Teslas and whatnot.
Of course.
But you will still get reports which are valuable to you with findings, and you stay in budget, right? Like you in a bug bounty program, you say, hey, I only want to spend, I don't know, like $3,000 for the whole year. And then once this budget is exhausted, well, you don't get any further reports, right? But it's viable. I mean, take Apple for an example. If you find a critical in Apple, like you can delete something from the Apple store, they pay you $80,000, right? For a vulnerability like this. A startup is not able to pay you $80,000, right?
No.
Obviously. But the principle is the same, right? Like the difference with Apple and Tesla and Facebook and those big guys is that they will attract the best talent in the world, right? Like the best bug bounty hunters, because they are only going for the big fish.
Yeah.
But it's totally a valid option. I think it's more like how to structure it, right? It's not necessarily a budget issue. It's more how to structure it, how to utilize it, and to have someone like you, for example, to guide them through the steps. It's more like creating a framework for them from a security perspective, rather than just throwing dollars at the wall and hoping for the best.
Yeah. And on that point, and to finish off, because we've got to wrap up, and I'm sure we can come together again and deep dive into some of these topics if required, right? But on that point, you know, if anyone's got any challenges, questions, or needs help around development of software or the security of applications and all of the things we've talked about today, please get in touch. I cannot thank the guys enough for jumping on this podcast. Dear friends of mine, and I hope you'll agree, real subject matter experts in their own field. So Martin, Gonzalo, thank you so much. We're going to wrap up, but I'm sure we'll be back in due course. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.